I used to believe that family meant something permanent, something that couldn't be broken by time or circumstance or the slow decay of a body that once carried children and cooked meals and fixed broken things around the house. I used to believe that the love I poured into every scraped knee and every late-night fever and every college tuition payment would somehow echo back to me when I needed it most. But sitting at that dinner table on a cold November evening, surrounded by faces I had known longer than any other faces in the world, I learned that belief was just another comfortable lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. The restaurant was one of those expensive places with small portions and waiters who hover like anxious birds, the kind of place my son David always chose when he wanted to make an impression or feel important or prove something to himself about how far he had climbed from the modest two-bedroom house where he grew up. The chandeliers threw warm light across white tablecloths and everyone was dressed nicely, my daughter-in-law Jennifer in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly prescriptions, my granddaughter Emma scrolling through her phone with the practiced disinterest of 17, and David himself in a charcoal suit that made him look like a stranger, like someone I might pass on the street without recognizing. I had worn my best dress, the navy one with the pearl buttons that I saved for special occasions, and I had taken extra time with my makeup to hide the gray pallor that seemed to live in my skin now, the shadow of illness that no amount of concealer could quite cover. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my water glass, the tremor that had started 6 months ago and grown worse each week, and I tried to steady them before anyone noticed, tried to hold myself together the way I always had. The conversation moved around me like a river flowing past a stone, discussions of vacation plans and business deals and Emma's college applications, and I smiled and nodded and tried to contribute when there was space, but mostly I just listened and felt the familiar ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition and everything to do with the growing sense that I was becoming invisible, that I was fading from their lives like an old photograph left too long in the sun. When the appetizers came I picked at a salad I didn't want, my appetite gone the way so many things had gone lately, and I noticed Jennifer glancing at David with that look married people develop, that silent communication that speaks volumes without a single word. Something was coming, I could feel it the way you can feel a storm building on a summer afternoon, and I set down my fork and waited for whatever blow was about to fall. David cleared his throat in that deliberate way he had when he was about to say something he had rehearsed, and suddenly everyone was looking at me with expressions that mixed pity and determination and something else I couldn't quite name, something that made my stomach tighten with dread. He started talking about my health, about the falls I'd had and the medications I was juggling and the memory lapses that had become more frequent, and I felt my face grow hot because these were private things, intimate failures that I had tried to handle quietly without bothering anyone or asking for help. He talked about assisted living facilities as if they were vacation resorts, as if moving me into one was some kind of generous gift rather than an exile, and Jennifer nodded along and added comments about safety and proper care and how they had toured several places that were really quite nice. Emma didn't look up from her phone. The words washed over me and I felt myself shrinking in my chair, becoming smaller and smaller until I might disappear entirely, and then David said the thing that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward, the thing that would change everything between us forever. He said I was becoming a burden, said it kindly with concern in his voice, said it as if he were delivering difficult news rather than driving a knife between my ribs, said it as if those 5 decades of motherhood and sacrifice and unconditional love could be reduced to a ledger where I had suddenly moved from the asset column to the liability side. He said they had busy lives and couldn't be expected to drop everything every time I had a crisis, said Jennifer's career was at a critical point and Emma needed their attention during these important college years, said it would be better for everyone if I were somewhere with trained staff who could monitor me properly. The restaurant noise continued around us, the clink of silverware and the murmur of other families having better conversations, and I sat there absorbing this announcement that my presence had become inconvenient, that I had overstayed my welcome in the lives of people I had created and raised and loved more than I had ever loved myself. I didn't argue or cry or make a scene, I just nodded slowly and said I understood and asked to be excused because suddenly I couldn't breathe in that expensive restaurant with its careful lighting and its pretty lies. I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall and stood there shaking, not from the tremor in my hands but from rage and grief and the awful clarity that comes when you finally see yourself through someone else's eyes and realize you have become expendable. I looked at my reflection in the mirror when I came out, at the woman who had aged so much in the past year, at the lines around her mouth and the fear in her eyes, and I made a decision right there amid the marble and gold fixtures and piped-in classical music. I decided that if I was going to be discarded, I would at least control the terms of my disposal. The drive home was silent, David insisting on taking me even though I said I could manage, and when he pulled up to the small house I had moved to after their father died, the house I had bought with the life insurance money because I didn't want to burden anyone, he tried to hug me and I let him but felt nothing, no warmth or connection, Just the hollow performance of an embrace between people who were related by blood but no longer by any bond that mattered. I went inside and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about all the ways I had failed, all the ways I had been too much trouble and not enough help, and then I got up and started making phone calls, started setting in motion the quiet decision I had made in that restaurant bathroom while my family finished their expensive meals without me. I called my lawyer first, the one who had handled my will when I thought there was still a family who deserved what little I had to leave, and I made an appointment for the following week, told him I needed to make some changes and it was urgent. Then I called the hospital where I had been going for my treatments and asked about the clinical trial I had been offered 6 months ago, the experimental treatment for my condition that the doctor said was risky but might extend my life by years if it worked, the trial I had hesitated to join because it required extensive time and travel and I didn't want to inconvenience anyone. I told them I was ready to enroll, that I had no commitments holding me back, that I could start immediately. Then I called my cousin Margaret in Arizona who had been asking me for years to come visit, to escape the cold winters and the loneliness, and I told her I was thinking of making a more permanent move, asked if she meant it about having room for me in her guest house. Her voice on the phone was warm with surprise and pleasure and I realized with a sharp pang that I had forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely wanted somewhere. Over the next few weeks I moved through my days like a ghost in my own life, going to appointments and making arrangements and slowly dismantling the careful structure I had built around my son's family, the structure of availability and grandmother duties and emergency contact listings. I stopped calling David except when he called me, stopped offering to babysit Emma even though she was far too old for babysitting, stopped trying to insert myself into their lives in the desperate way I had been doing, the way you cling to something that's slipping through your fingers. I felt lighter somehow, as if shedding the burden of being a burden had freed up space in my chest for breath I didn't know I'd been holding. David seemed relieved by my new distance, interpreted it as acceptance of his plan, called occasionally to update me on the assisted living facilities he was touring on my behalf, and I let him talk without correcting his assumptions about my future. The clinical trial was grueling in ways I hadn't anticipated, long days at the hospital with treatments that left me exhausted and nauseated and questioning whether extending a life that had become so small was worth the fight. But something stubborn in me refused to quit, some spark of defiance that said I would not go gentle into the irrelevance my son had assigned me, and I showed up for every appointment and endured every side effect and slowly, impossibly, started to feel stronger. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, said my numbers were improving in ways they hadn't expected, said I might be one of the lucky ones for whom the treatment actually worked, and I thought about the irony of fighting so hard to live when the people who were supposed to care most whether I lived or died had already written me off as too much trouble. Margaret's guest house was small but filled with light, with windows that looked out on desert landscapes that were nothing like the gray skies I had known all my life, and she welcomed me with a warmth that made me realize how cold I had been for so long. We fell into an easy rhythm of morning coffee and afternoon walks and evening conversations that ranged across decades of shared history, and I felt pieces of myself returning that I thought had been lost forever, the version of me that existed before I became just someone's mother or someone's burden. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before David was born, setting up an easel in the corner of the guest house and losing hours to color and form and the pure pleasure of creation without purpose or audience. Margaret would come by and admire my work and we would talk about art and books and our lives, really talk in the way I hadn't talked to anyone in years, and I realized I had been starving for this kind of connection, this recognition of myself as a whole person rather than just a collection of needs and failures. The lawyer's office was downtown in a building I had passed 1,000 times without really seeing, and when I sat across from him with the revised documents spread between us, I felt a strange calm settle over me like snow. The will I had made years ago had left everything to David, a modest inheritance of savings and life insurance and the small house that represented a lifetime of careful financial management, because that's what parents did, they passed on what little they had accumulated to the next generation without question or condition. But sitting there looking at those pages I thought about burden and love and whether one could exist without the other, whether care could be measured in dollars or duty or whether it was something else entirely, something my son had failed to understand when he calculated my value and found it wanting. I signed new documents that morning, documents that redirected my estate in ways David would never anticipate, and when I walked out into the sunshine I felt free in a way I hadn't felt since before that dinner, since before I learned that love has limits and family has expiration dates. 6 months passed in the Arizona desert, 6 months of sun and art and the slow rebuilding of a self I thought I had lost, and the clinical trial continued to exceed expectations, my health stabilizing in ways that shocked my doctors and shocked me more, as if my body had been waiting for permission to heal, waiting for me to choose myself over the obligations that had been crushing me into dust. I sent postcards to David occasionally, cheerful notes about the weather in Margaret's garden, and he responded with texts that were friendly but distant, still updating me periodically about assisted living options he was exploring for when I was ready to come back, and I never corrected his assumption that I would be coming back. Never mentioned the lease I had signed on the guest house or the studio space I had rented downtown for my painting or the new doctor who was managing my care with a combination of the trial drugs and a holistic approach that actually seemed to be working. Then one afternoon my phone rang with David's number, and when I answered his voice was different, urgent, and confused, and he said he had received a letter from my lawyer about updating my emergency contacts and next of kin, and he didn't understand why things were being changed without discussion. I could hear Jennifer in the background saying something sharp and worried, and I realized the moment I had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating had arrived, the moment when my quiet decision would become visible and I would have to speak the truth I had been avoiding. I told him to check his mail, told him there was a letter I had sent that would explain everything, and that I ended the call before he could ask more questions, before I could lose my nerve and soften the blow I needed to deliver. The letter had taken me weeks to write, going through draft after draft until I found words that were honest without being cruel, clear without being vindictive, final without being dramatic. I explained about the clinical trial and my improved health, about Margaret and Arizona and the life I had built that didn't include them, about the changes to my will that redirected my estate to medical research and art education programs, and the cousin who had given me shelter when I needed it most. I wrote about that dinner in the expensive restaurant. About the word burden and how it had crystallized something I had been feeling for years but hadn't wanted to acknowledge, the slow erasure of my personhood as I became nothing more than a problem to be solved or managed or, preferably, institutionalized. I wrote that I didn't blame him, that I understood how aging parents could become inconvenient in busy lives, but that understanding didn't obligate me to participate in my own diminishment, didn't require me to accept being discarded simply because I had become difficult. I wrote that the inheritance he had been counting on without ever saying he was counting on it would not be coming to him, that I had decided to invest my remaining resources in causes that mattered to me and in people who had shown me genuine care rather than dutiful tolerance. I wrote that this wasn't punishment but rather clarity, a recognition that money given out of obligation rather than love was a burden itself, and I was releasing both of us from that burden. I wrote that he was welcome to visit if he wanted to know me as a person rather than as a responsibility, but that I would no longer be available to play the role of grateful elderly mother waiting patiently for whatever attention he could spare between his important commitments. I signed it with my name, just my name, not mom or mother, because those titles suddenly felt like costumes I had worn too long, performances I no longer had the energy to maintain. David called back within hours of receiving the letter, called repeatedly until I finally answered, and his voice was a mixture of anger and panic and something that might have been heard if I had been generous enough to interpret it that way. He said I was being irrational and cruel, said I was punishing him for trying to help, said Jennifer was devastated and Emma was confused and how could I do this to the family after everything they had done for me. I let him talk until he ran out of words, and then I asked quietly what exactly they had done for me in the past year besides decide I was too much trouble and plan my exile to a facility where I could be someone else's problem, and the silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. He tried a different approach then, his voice softening into the reasonable tone he used for difficult negotiations, saying we could discuss this like adults, saying surely I didn't mean to cut them out completely over one difficult conversation, saying he had only been thinking of my welfare when he suggested assisted living. I told him I was thinking of my welfare too, thinking of it clearly for the first time in years, and that my welfare included not spending my remaining time with people who saw me as a burden rather than a person worthy of love and attention on my own terms. I told him about the painting I was doing and the health improvements the trial had brought and the community I had found in Arizona, and I heard the surprise in his voice as he realized I had built an entire life he knew nothing about, had become someone he didn't recognize from the diminished woman who had sat silently at that dinner table while her future was discussed around her like she wasn't present. He asked when I was coming home and I told him I was home, that the small house he was so eager to sell so I could afford assisted living was already listed with a realtor and the proceeds would go to charity, and I heard Jennifer's voice in the background rising in pitch and understood that the inheritance they had been counting on for Emma's Ivy League dreams or their vacation property or whatever plans they had made with money that was mine but they had somehow claimed as theirs was evaporating in real time. David's tone turned cold then, the warmth of even strained family feeling dropping away to reveal something harder and more calculating underneath. And he said I was being selfish and spiteful, said I had always been difficult but this was beyond understanding, said he supposed this was what happened when elderly people made decisions without proper oversight. That last comment hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt something inside me